There are leaders in history who refuse to accept that they have made a mistake, who look at the evidence, the reports, the casualties, the retreating armies, the maps that keep changing in the wrong direction, and decide that the problem is not their decision, but the men they chose to execute it. Benito Mussolini was one of those leaders. In October 1940, Il Duce invaded Greece with the absolute certainty that the campaign would last 2 weeks. He had been told this by his generals. He had told this to Hitler. He had planned the victory parade in Athens before the first Italian soldier crossed the Albanian border. Within 3 weeks, the Greek army had stopped the Italian advance cold. Within 6 weeks, Greek forces had pushed the Italians back across the border into Albania and were advancing on Italian positions. Within 90 days, 3 of Italy's most senior military figures had been removed from their posts, fired, resigned under pressure, or replaced in circumstances that amounted to the same thing. Because Greece kept making the confident predictions of their superiors look ridiculous. 3 generals, 90 days, the same enemy. It was not bad luck. It was not bad weather, though the weather in the Albanian mountains in the winter of 1940 was brutal beyond anything the Italian military had planned for. It was not inadequate equipment, though the Italian army's equipment had serious shortcomings that the campaign exposed with painful clarity. It was Greece. The story of how Mussolini burned through his generals trying to defeat an enemy he had dismissed before the first shot was fired is one of the most complete military humiliations of the Second World War. It happened in public. It happened while Hitler was watching. It happened while the Italian people were being told by their newspapers that victory was imminent, while the generals responsible for that imminent victory were being quietly removed from their posts and replaced by men who would soon discover why their predecessors had failed. This is that story. To understand what happened to Mussolini's generals in Albania, you need to understand what Mussolini believed about Greece before the invasion. He believed Greece was irrelevant, not weak in the way that a professional military man describes a weak opponent, with specific reference to equipment deficiencies and manpower limitations and logistical vulnerabilities. Irrelevant in the way that a man who has decided the outcome before examining the evidence describes an obstacle he has already mentally dismissed. Greece was a small Balkan nation with a population of 7 million, a military budget that was a fraction of Italy's, equipment that was outdated by any modern standard, and a history that Mussolini read selectively, emphasizing the centuries of Ottoman domination and minimizing the military achievements that were right in front of him. He had other reasons for invading beyond military calculation, political reasons. The relationship between Italy and Germany had been increasingly defined by Hitler's independent actions, the occupation of Romania, the expansion into Eastern Europe, that Mussolini had not been consulted about, and that made him look like a junior partner in his own alliance. He wanted a parallel victory, something Italy had done alone, without German assistance, that demonstrated Italian military power independently of the German machine that was making Hitler the dominant figure of European fascism. Greece was supposed to be that demonstration. He told his foreign minister and son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, in the days before the invasion that Greece would be handled quickly, efficiently, without drama. He told Hitler by letter, not in person, not with the courtesy of advance notice that an alliance between equals requires, that Italy was moving against Greece and that the matter would be concluded before Hitler had time to form an opinion about it. The letter arrived while Hitler was at a train station in Florence, meeting Mussolini for a diplomatic discussion about other matters. Hitler read it. His reaction, which he expressed privately to his staff and which was recorded in documents that survived the war, was one of professional alarm. He understood what Mussolini apparently did not, that the mountains of northern Greece and southern Albania in October were not terrain that favored a rapid offensive, that the Greek army, whatever its equipment limitations, had fighting quality that the Italian assessment had not adequately examined, that the timing, with winter approaching, was wrong in ways that could not be corrected by willpower or political determination. He said nothing to Mussolini. The alliance required a certain diplomatic discretion. And perhaps there was also, in Hitler's calculation, a recognition that an Italian failure in Greece, if it came, would have its own strategic uses in clarifying the relative power of the two dictators. The Italian military plan for the invasion of Greece was developed under the command of General Sebastiano Visconti Prasca. He was the commander of Italian forces in Albania, a man who had been in the region long enough to have opinions about Greek military capability and who had formed those opinions in a way that confirmed what Mussolini wanted to hear rather than what the evidence suggested. Prasca believed the campaign would be over in 2 weeks. He said so in writing. He based this assessment on a reading of Greek military capacity that was not just outdated, it was willfully incomplete. The 1897 war between Greece and the Ottoman Empire, which ended in Greek defeat, was his primary reference point. He had the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 available to him, wars in which the Greek army had demonstrated a quality that shocked the Ottoman military establishment and doubled the size of the Greek state in 6 weeks. He had the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922 available to him, a campaign in which Greek forces advanced deep into Anatolia against a determined enemy. He had the evidence of a Greek military that had been systematically reformed through the 1930s under General Alexandros Papagos. He ignored all of it. He chose the oldest available reference point because it supported the conclusion he had already reached. He told his political masters what they wanted to hear. On October 28, 1940, the Italian ultimatum expires. Mussolini has demanded the right to occupy strategic positions inside Greece. Greek Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas has given his answer, a single word, no, and the Italian army in Albania begins its advance across the Greek border. The advance goes badly from the first day. The Italian plan requires speed. It requires the Greek defensive positions on the border to be overrun quickly before the Greek army can organize a coherent response, before the terrain and the weather and the logistical difficulties of fighting in Albanian mountain passes in late October can become factors that negate Italian numerical advantage. The Greek defensive positions are not overrun quickly. The Greek army defending the border in Epirus and Macedonia is not the force that Prasca's assessment described. It is a force that has been preparing for exactly this situation, that Metaxas, whatever his political failings, has been quietly building and improving through the late 1930s in the recognition that Italy's expansionist ambitions in the Balkans made a confrontation increasingly likely. The men in those positions know the terrain because it is their terrain. They know the approaches because they have studied them. They have prepared defensive positions, registered artillery fire, identified the routes that an Italian advance would have to use because the mountains leave no other options. The Italian advance stalls within days. The 3rd Alpine Division. Giulia, one of the elite formations of the Italian army, mountain troops trained specifically for exactly this kind of terrain, advances into the Pindus Mountains and is surrounded by Greek forces that use the terrain with a knowledge and aggressiveness that the Italian Alpine troops, for all their training, cannot match in ground that the Greeks have been living in for generations. The Julia division is cut off, takes massive casualties, and has to fight its way out of encirclement in an engagement that becomes one of the early defining moments of the campaign. The Julia division was supposed to be the best Italy had for mountain warfare. If the best Italy had for mountain warfare could be surrounded and nearly destroyed in the first week, the assessment that the campaign would last 2 weeks was not an assessment. It was a fantasy. In Rome, Mussolini receives the reports from Albania with a mounting fury. The reports do not say what the plan said they would say. The advance is not progressing. The Greeks are not breaking. The 2-week timetable is already irrelevant. On November 9th, 1940, 12 days after the invasion began, 11 days behind the timetable that Prasca had promised, Mussolini removes Prasca from command. The man who told him the campaign would last 2 weeks is gone. His replacement in the field is General Ubaldo Soddu, the Under-Secretary of War, a man whose primary qualification for the role is that he is available and that Mussolini believes, at this specific moment, that a fresh commander with fresh energy will solve what a failed commander could not. In Rome, simultaneously, the pressure is building at the highest levels of Italian military leadership. Pietro Badoglio, the chief of the General Staff, the most senior military officer in Italy, the man whose institutional position made him ultimately responsible for the strategic planning that produced this disaster, is being made to feel the weight of that responsibility. On December 6, 1940, less than a month after Prasca's removal, with the situation in Albania continuing to deteriorate, Badoglio resigns. He does not wait to be fired. He reads the political situation in Rome with the accuracy of a man who has been reading it for 40 years and understands that his resignation, offered before the dismissal comes, preserves more of his institutional position than being sacked would. He cites inadequate resources. He cites political interference in operational decisions. He cites everything except the quality of the enemy that has made all of it irrelevant. Mussolini accepts the resignation. General number 2, gone. 6 weeks into a 2-week campaign. Meanwhile, in Albania, Soddu is discovering what every general who takes command of a failing campaign discovers. The problems are not the previous commander's problems. They are the campaign's problems. The terrain has not changed. The Greek army has not gotten worse. The Italian logistical situation has not improved. What has changed is the name on the command post door. The Greek counteroffensive begins in mid-November 1940. It is not a limited counterattack designed to restore the pre-invasion border. It is a full offensive, coordinated, aggressive, professionally planned, that exploits the overextension of Italian forward units and the logistical fragility that the failed offensive has created. Greek divisions push into Albanian territory. Greek soldiers advance through mountain passes in conditions that military doctrine says should halt offensive operations entirely. They advance anyway. By the end of November, the Greek army has pushed the Italians back across the entire border and is advancing into Albania itself. The Italian divisions that were supposed to be in Athens by mid-November are retreating through the same passes they crossed 4 weeks earlier in the opposite direction. Soddu watches this from his command post and does something that his subordinates find difficult to fully explain in their post-war memoirs. He composes music. Ubaldo Soddu is, in his private life, a composer of film music, a hobby that in peacetime is unremarkable and in the middle of a military catastrophe becomes a symbol of command dysfunction that his officers cannot forget. While Greek forces advance and Italian units retreat and the maps change in the wrong direction every day, The commander of Italian forces in Albania is writing film scores in his quarters. By late December 1940, Soddu's mental and physical condition has deteriorated to the point where his ability to command is genuinely in question. He requests relief, citing ill health. Mussolini grants it. He is replaced in field command in Albania by General Ugo Cavallero, a more capable administrator and organizer who will spend the next year trying to stabilize a front that the Greek campaign has left in a state of near collapse. General Number 3 gone from his post. Prasca fired. Badoglio resigned under pressure. Soddu relieved, citing health, in circumstances that leave no doubt about the real reason. 3 figures removed from their posts. 90 days. The same enemy. In the German military observer reports filed from Albania during these months, reports sent to Berlin by officers attached to the Italian command whose job was to assess Italian military capability, there is a consistency of observation that reflects professional precision rather than Allied propaganda. They describe Italian units that fight with individual courage but collapse under coordinated pressure. They describe logistics that cannot sustain offensive operations. They describe a command culture optimized for managing political relationships in Rome rather than solving tactical problems in Albanian mountain passes. And they describe the Greeks with the professional respect that German military reporting consistently produces when it encounters an opponent who is fighting better than the assessment predicted. They describe Greek units that hold under pressure that should break them. They describe counterattacks that come when Italian doctrine says the Greek forces should be consolidating. They describe what happens when you send an army optimized for political theater against an army fighting for its actual survival. Most people will never hear this story. They'll go their whole lives not knowing what happened to those Italian generals and why. If that bothers you, if you think the silence around these moments is wrong, subscribe to this channel. We're filling that silence one video at a time. And if this story deserved to be told, hit that like button. The strategic consequences of the Italian failure in Greece extended far beyond the Albanian front. Hitler, who had been watching the Italian campaign with professional alarm, was forced to act. The German intervention in Greece, Operation Marita, April 1941, was not part of the original German strategic plan. It was a consequence of Italian failure. Greece, which should have been an Italian sphere of influence secured by a quick campaign in October 1940, had instead become an open wound consuming Italian military resources and embarrassing the Axis alliance in front of every neutral observer in Europe. The delay that Operation Marita imposed on German strategic planning has been argued by military historians ever since as a contribution to the failure of Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union, originally planned for May 1941, launched on June 22nd. The weeks that separated those dates, weeks consumed partly by the Greek campaign that Mussolini's failure made necessary, were weeks that separated the German advance from Moscow before winter arrived. The argument is debated. The causation is complex. What is not debated is that Mussolini's decision to invade Greece without consulting Hitler and the Italian military's failure to execute that invasion successfully forced a German intervention that consumed time and resources from the most important strategic operation of the entire war. 3 figures removed in 90 days, and the ripple effects reached all the way to the gates of Moscow. In Italy, the Albanian disaster had political consequences that ultimately reached Mussolini himself. The military humiliation by Greece created a credibility gap between the fascist regime's claims of martial greatness and the reality that the Italian people could observe in the casualty lists and the returned soldiers. The The Greeks were not a significant industrial power. They were not a nation with the latest equipment and most advanced military doctrine. They were a small country that Italy had invaded with the confidence of a large country invading a small one, and they had won. Not in the final strategic sense. Germany eventually conquered Greece in April 1941, but in the specific, tangible, documented sense of making Italy's military look incompetent, consuming three of Italy's most senior figures in 90 days and forcing Germany to do what Italy could not. Ugo Cavallero, who replaced Soddu in field command, eventually stabilized the Albanian front sufficiently to prevent total collapse, but never recovered the initiative the failed offensive had squandered. He spent 18 months managing a front that had been created by the decisions of the men who came before him. Pietro Badoglio, who resigned rather than be fired in December 1940, eventually became one of the key figures in the overthrow of Mussolini himself in July 1943. The man whose institutional position made him partly responsible for the strategic failure that helped undermine the fascist regime's credibility became the prime minister who signed Italy's armistice with the Allies. History sometimes moves in circles that justice would not have designed, but that irony would. The Greek soldiers who stopped the Italian invasion in October 1940 and pushed the Italian army back into Albania through November and December are among the most celebrated in modern Greek history. October 28th, the day Metaxas said Ohi, is a national holiday in Greece. Ohi Day, the day the country said no to a vastly larger military power and meant it. The day that set in motion the campaign that would consume three Italian military figures, force German intervention, and contribute to the delay of Barbarossa. The men who fought in those mountains in the winter of 1940 and 1941 did so in conditions that strain description. The Albanian mountains in winter are brutal. Cold that kills equipment, snow that makes movement nearly impossible, terrain that turns every advance into a physical ordeal, regardless of what the enemy is doing. Greek soldiers advancing into Albania in November and December 1940 were doing so without adequate winter equipment, without the logistical support that modern armies require, sustained by something that does not appear in any order of battle assessment. They were sustained by the knowledge that they were right, that the country had been invaded without provocation, that the answer given on October 28th was the right answer, that whatever the cost, the alternative, accepting the ultimatum, allowing Italian occupation of strategic positions, becoming what Bulgaria and Romania had become, was worse than any mountain in any winter. They paid an enormous cost. The Greek casualties in the Albanian campaign, killed, wounded, frostbitten, missing, numbered in the tens of thousands. The conditions in the mountains produce suffering that the official casualty figures do not fully capture. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite in positions where medical evacuation was measured in days rather than hours. Units held positions under supply conditions that would have justified withdrawal by any professional standard. They held anyway, and in Rome, Benito Mussolini removed general after general and raged at his staff and sent reinforcement after reinforcement to a campaign he had promised would last 2 weeks, all while the small country he had dismissed as irrelevant demonstrated with a consistency that the casualty reports made impossible to deny that it had not read the Italian assessment of its military capability and was not behaving accordingly. The three figures whose careers were ended or damaged in those 90 days are footnotes in most histories of the Second World War. Prasca, Badoglio, Soddu, the names appear in the specialist literature and in the Greek histories of the campaign and in the memoirs of the men who served under them. They do not appear in the popular histories. They are not the famous names of the war. But what happened to them is not a footnote. What happened to them is the story of what a small nation with the right motivation does to the assumptions of a larger power that has not done its homework. The story of what Greek soldiers in Albanian mountain passes in the winter of 1940 did to Italian strategic planning, to Italian military credibility, and ultimately to the timeline of the most consequential military operation in the history of the Eastern Front. 3 generals, 90 days, the same enemy. Greece did that. If you felt the weight of this story, that's history doing what it's supposed to do. That like button honors that feeling. Don't skip it. We carry these stories carefully. Every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and help us maintain it. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below. If your family has a connection to the Albanian campaign, Greek, Italian, Albanian, tell us in the comments. We read everything. Thank you for carrying the weight of these soldiers' story forward. The ones who said Ohi and meant it, the ones who advanced into Albania in conditions that should have stopped them. They bore something heavier than any mountain. The least we can do is remember it.